I work as a nurse in a rural hospital in Nebraska. There are some strange rules that we have to follow. It wasn't a handshake that led me to Crestwood Hospital, a forgotten relic hidden in the vast fields of rural Nebraska, but rather a lack of alternatives. My name is Emily Carter, 26, a former med school dropout and a magnet for poor decisions. I had a tendency to run toward red flags, and the $65 per hour night shift posting was practically a beacon. They called it desperation pay in my old circles, wages so high they made you wonder why. I arrived at Crestwood late on a Monday afternoon, thick fog rolling in and wrapping around the desolate streets. The hospital stood like a mausoleum, its faded white paint barely clinging to the deteriorating brick facade. A single fluorescent light flickered outside the main entrance, offering a weak glow over the now hiring sign taped to the door. Inside, the air reeked of antiseptic and something else, something sour and faintly metallic. The receptionist, a frail woman with hollow cheeks and quick, bird-like movements, handed me an ID badge before I could even introduce myself. Her skeletal fingers pressed a folded slip of paper into my palm. "Read these," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the hum of a distant generator. Her eyes darted to the hallway behind me, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge. The paper appeared ordinary at first glance, its contents printed in a font so tiny I had to squint. But as I read, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. The rules of Crestwood night shift. Do not lock the doors of room 6 after 3:33 a.m. If you hear whistling from the east wing, seek another room immediately. Do not search for the source. Patients in room 12 will ask for water. Only provided if the cup contains exactly 4 ice cubes. If your ID badge goes missing after midnight, exit the building immediately. Do not return for 72 hours. The elevator is off limits between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Always use the stairs. Do not acknowledge the man in the janitor's closet, even if he speaks to you. If a patient checks in without a name, do not record them in the registry. Do not use the break room microwave after midnight. The phone will ring once between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m. Under no circumstances should you answer it. If you smell lavender near the nurse's station, keep your head down and count to 10 before moving. When your shift ends, leave immediately. Do not look back. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, forcing myself to breathe steadily. Rules were standard in hospitals, but these felt different, more like they were written out of fear than protocol. As I walked toward the staff quarters, my mind spun with questions. Who wrote these rules? And why did every instinct scream at me to leave the moment I stepped inside? "Welcome to the team," the receptionist called after me, her voice trembling. I didn't reply. The first night at Crestwood Hospital was uneventful until it wasn't. The shift began like any other graveyard shift, drenched in silence. The air felt unnervingly still, like the attic of an old house where dust swirls in unseen currents. The fluorescent lights overhead emitted a soft, persistent buzz that seemed to burrow into my skull. I spent the first couple of hours sorting supplies at the nurse's station. The hospital, though operational, had seen better days. The paint on the walls peeled away in patches, revealing the raw wood beneath. The floors groaned with every step, and the occasional flicker of the lights didn't help. Still, nothing seemed overtly sinister. It was just an aging building, I reassured myself, a remnant of better times. At 1:15 a.m., the phone rang. I froze, the rules flashing in my mind. Rule 9. The phone will ring once between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m. Do not answer it. It rang just once, as promised by the rule, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. I had the urge to pick it up, just to check if the line was dead, but the rules echoed like an alarm in my mind. I stayed put. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do my rounds. The hallways stretched endlessly, their shadows distorted by dim lighting. My footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud. Room 6 was empty, its door slightly ajar. I hesitated briefly before continuing, the rules whispering at the back of my mind. Do not lock the doors of room 6 after 3:33 a.m. It wasn't until I reached the east wing that I heard it, the whistling. It started faintly, like a tune drifting in on the wind, but there was no wind inside Crestwood. It grew louder, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound was oddly cheerful, like a children's melody, but it felt wrong, too slow, too intentional. Rule 2, if you hear whistling from the east wing, find another room immediately. Do not search for the source. Without hesitation, I turned and sprinted toward room 10, the closest door. My hands shook as I gripped the handle and pushed it open. The room was vacant, the bed perfectly made, but it was enough. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, holding my breath as the whistling carried on outside. Then, it stopped. Just like that. I waited in the suffocating silence, straining my ears for any sound. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds, it was impossible to tell. When I finally opened the door, the corridor was empty. Nothing stirred, but the air felt dense, heavier. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to shake the feeling off, but the weight in my chest remained. It wasn't just the whistling that unnerved me, it was the unsettling sensation that something had been watching. Waiting. I glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. 2 more hours to go. By the time I returned to the nurse's station, my nerves were shot. My shift wasn't even halfway over, and I already felt like I was losing control. I distracted myself by going through the patient log. It didn't take long. Crestwood housed only a handful of patients, mostly elderly locals with nowhere else to go. That's when I noticed something unusual. Room 6, the supposedly empty room I had passed earlier, was listed as occupied. A name was scrawled in untidy handwriting next to it, Evelyn Carter. My stomach churned. I distinctly remember the light being off, the bed perfectly untouched. No one had mentioned a patient being admitted there during my shift. I stared at the list of rules taped inside my locker. Rule 3, if a patient appears in room 6, check the log. If their name is listed, you must visit them immediately. Do not let them speak first. The rule felt absurd. Why would it matter who spoke first? But the lingering memory of the earlier whistling gnawed at me, and my curiosity was eclipsed by growing unease. I approached room 6 cautiously. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, each step feeling heavier. The closer I got, the louder the buzzing in my ears grew, as if the hospital itself was warning me away. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and suddenly, I was hyper-aware of my own breathing, the way it echoed inside my head like a countdown. I pushed the door open. The room was bathed in dim moonlight seeping through the blinds. On the bed lay an elderly woman, her silver hair fanned across the pillow, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Relief flooded through me. She was just a patient, a normal, sleeping patient. "Evelyn," I said, my voice cracking. Her eyes snapped open. I froze as they locked onto mine, wide and unblinking. Her lips twitched as though she were about to speak, but I remembered the rule just in time. "I'm your nurse for the night," I blurted quickly. "Is there something you need?" Her mouth closed, and for a long moment, she simply stared at me, her gaze vacant and unnerving. Then she lifted a frail hand and pointed to the bedside table. A glass of water sat there, untouched. My throat tightened, and my hand shook as I picked it up and held it out to her. She didn't take it. Instead, she pointed toward the dark corner of the room. I turned my head slowly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, taller than any human, shifting in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned back to Evelyn, but her eyes were closed again, her breathing soft and even. She looked as if she'd never moved. The glass of water slipped from my grip, shattering on the floor. I stumbled backward, rushing out and slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, panting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I returned to the nurse's station, I checked the log again. Evelyn Carter's name was gone. I spent the next hour at the nurse's station, pretending to update patient files while my thoughts spiraled. My mind replayed every detail of room 6, the unnervingly still woman, her silent pointing, and that shadow lurking in the corner. It had to be a trick of the light, right? A product of my anxiety and the eerie atmosphere of the hospital. Yet the rules loomed in my thoughts. Rule 3 had been accurate. Evelyn Carter's name had appeared and vanished, as if the hospital had a will of its own. My fingers trembled as I flipped the rules card over and over, rereading the neat handwriting. I told myself to focus. Just a few more hours, and my shift would be over. The hospital was eerily quiet now, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I checked the clock, 3:13 a.m. The infamous witching hour. That's when the lights started to flicker. It began subtly, a faint buzz overhead as the lights dimmed briefly before brightening again. At first, I barely noticed, but as time dragged on, the flickering grew more erratic. I glanced down the hallway leading to the patient rooms and froze. The lights above the corridor pulsed, casting shifting shadows along the walls. One shadow lingered longer than the rest. Too long. I turned back to the rules list, searching for reassurance. My eyes landed on Rule 5. If the hallway lights begin to flicker, do not investigate. Stay at the nurse's station no matter what you hear. Almost on cue, I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like footsteps. The hairs on my arms rose. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my things and leave, but the rule was clear: stay put. I swallowed my fear and forced myself to remain seated, gripping the desk as though it could ground me. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It echoed down the hall, sharp and rhythmic, almost like heels striking a marble floor. But it wasn't just the sound, it was the way it moved. The footsteps didn't follow the natural rhythm of someone walking. They stopped and started, sometimes too fast, sometimes pausing unnervingly long, as though whatever was out there wasn't entirely human. "Hello?" I called out before I could stop myself. My voice wavered, barely above a whisper over the pounding of my heart. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched endlessly. Then, a different sound filled the air, soft, raspy breathing. It was so close I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. I whipped around, my chair screeching against the floor. The hallway was empty, the flickering lights casting fleeting, distorted shadows along the walls. I stood on shaky legs and edged backward toward the supply closet. If someone, or something, was in the hospital with me, I needed to find a weapon. My hands fumbled with the closet door, and I slipped inside, shutting it quietly behind me. I grabbed the first object I could find, a heavy metal clipboard, and held onto it tightly. Through the thin door, I heard the breathing again. It was right outside now, a raspy inhale and exhale, slow and deliberate. My grip on the clipboard tightened, my knuckles turning white. The closet lights flickered once and then went out. I held my breath as darkness enveloped me completely. The tiny closet felt suffocating, each inch filled with the pounding of my own heartbeat. Pressing my back against the shelves, I clutched the clipboard like a lifeline. The breathing outside persisted, steady, intentional, as if it were savoring the fear it induced. Then it ceased. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. I exhaled shakily, trying to steady my nerves. Perhaps it had left. Maybe, whatever it was, it had decided I wasn't worth its time. My fingers brushed against the rule card in my pocket, and I pulled it out, gripping it like a good luck charm. My eyes landed on Rule 7, if you hear whispers, do not respond. They are not speaking to you. I barely had time to process it before the first whisper slipped through the door.
Emily.
It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, my name, spoken in a voice that felt off. It was recognizable but somehow wrong, as if someone were mimicking a voice they'd heard once but couldn't quite replicate. The hairs on the back of my neck bristled as the whispers multiplied, growing louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus.
Emily, come out. We need you. Emily, you can't stay there.
I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to shut out the noise, but it was pointless. The voices were no longer outside, they were inside my mind, slithering through my thoughts like parasites. I wanted to scream, but I bit down on my lip, recalling the rule: don't answer. Don't acknowledge them. The whispers shifted, turning sharper, more insistent. They chanted in eerie unison, their words now unintelligible. The air in the closet grew heavy, suffocating. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. Then, all at once, it stopped. I remained frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The air gradually felt lighter, the oppressive force lifting slightly. Slowly, my trembling fingers reached for the door handle. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I couldn't stay in there forever. Finally, I cracked the door open. The hallway was back to its usual dim state. The flickering had ceased, and the shadows were gone. Everything seemed normal. But the whispers weren't done with me. As I stepped out, they started again, this time, distant and faint. They weren't in my head anymore. They were coming from room 6. The door to the room was ajar, even though I had closed it earlier. A pale light spilled into the corridor, flickering weakly like an old bulb on its last legs. I wanted to run. Every fiber in my being screamed for me to flee this cursed hospital and never look back. But something drew me toward that room, something I couldn't explain. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps desperation, or maybe just the rules. The air outside room 6 was colder, sharper, like I had stepped across an invisible threshold into another reality. My breath misted in the dim hallway as the whispers continued, calling me closer. The light inside flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. I hesitated, gripping the doorframe tightly. The rule card burned in my pocket, its edges crinkled from my anxious grip. Rule 3: never enter room 6 unless absolutely necessary. If the door is open, close it and leave immediately. I had closed it before. I knew I had. Yet, here it was again, open, inviting, almost daring me to enter. My pulse thundered in my ears as I weighed my choices. Obey the rule or confront whatever lurked inside. I made my choice. With shaking fingers, I pushed the door closed. The latch clicked shut, unnaturally loud in the stillness, and for a fleeting moment, the whispers stopped. Relief flooded through me. But it didn't last. The door didn't stay closed. I watched in terror as the latch slid open on its own, the door creaking inward once more. The whispers returned, louder, triumphant. There was no doubt anymore, the hospital wanted me inside that room. And with reluctant steps, I entered. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, something akin to blood. The single overhead light flickered violently, illuminating the space in erratic bursts. The room was empty, save for a single hospital bed in the center, its white sheets pristine and neatly arranged. But something was wrong. As I approached, I noticed depressions on the sheets, imprints, as if someone had been lying there. My stomach twisted, and I hesitantly reached out, my hand hovering over the empty space. The sheets felt unnaturally cold beneath my fingertips. When I pulled my hand back, I saw condensation forming, dampening my fingertips. A faint creak shattered the stillness, and I spun to face the door. It had closed behind me. My pulse quickened as I lunged for it, gripping the handle and pulling with all my might. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispers swelled, filling the room in a chaotic chorus. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was futile. The voices were here now, circling like predators. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, clutching the rule card as if it could save me. Then the voices ceased. A single, chilling voice emerged from behind me.
You shouldn't be here.
I froze, every muscle tensed as I slowly turned. My gaze landed on the bed. The indentations in the sheets were no longer just faint impressions. The unmistakable outline of a figure lay beneath, and as I watched, the sheets moved, rising and falling with the rhythm of steady breathing.
Leave.
The voice repeated, quieter this time. It was coming from the bed. But I couldn't leave. The door refused to open, and the walls seemed to close in with every passing moment. Panic gnawed at my chest as I backed away, eyes locked on the figure under the sheets. With agonizing slowness, the sheets slid down. Inch by inch, they revealed pale, bluish skin stretched over angular cheekbones. Sunken eyes remained closed, as if whatever lay beneath had been here for an eternity. My breath caught, my knees shook, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The whispers shifted into a deep, resonant hum, reverberating through the walls like a swarm of unseen creatures. My grip on the rule card tightened. Rule 4, do not engage with the voices. If they seem directed at you, leave immediately. But how could I leave? The door was still locked, and the figure was stirring. Its eyelids fluttered, and then snapped open. The eyes were not human, milky and gray, like twin moons staring through me. My breath hitched as the figure sat up, its movements unnaturally fluid, the sound of cracking joints piercing the silence. It twisted its head toward me, the neck rotating too far with an audible crunch. Its lips parted, revealing teeth jagged like shattered glass.
You don't belong here.
It rasped, its voice like wind scraping through empty corridors. I stumbled back, pressing against the door. I didn't mean to, I just...
Rule breaker.
The figure hissed, its voice intensifying. The bed groaned as it swung its legs over the edge, bare feet touching the cold tile. The humming in the walls deepened, joined by a faint tapping, like fingers tapping against glass. My hands scrambled at the doorknob, twisting and pulling in desperation. It remained locked. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs like an unseen force. The figure rose, towering over me, its head nearly grazing the ceiling. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and wrong. The overhead light flickered wildly, casting fractured shadows across the walls. Then I saw them. The shadows weren't just of me and the figure. They multiplied, dozens, maybe more, standing in the room's dark corners, just beyond the reach of the light. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. But it was. The shadows inched closer, their forms becoming more distinct. The whispers swelled into a chaotic symphony, pounding inside my skull.
You were warned.
The figure said, its voice slicing through the noise like a blade.
You didn't listen.
Guys, I dream of getting 1,000 subscribers on the channel. So please subscribe, it really helps to develop the channel. I followed the rules, I stammered, raising the rule card like a shield. I tried. The thing tilted its head, considering me with those lifeless eyes.
Once you enter room 6, the rules no longer matter.
The lights flickered one final time before plunging the room into darkness. My screams were swallowed whole, the last image burned into my mind, its jagged teeth lunging toward me. I woke up in my car, parked in the hospital lot. My hands trembled against the icy steering wheel. The clock on the dashboard blinked 3:33 a.m. My throat burned as if I'd been screaming, but I had no recollection of escaping room 6. My uniform clung to me, damp with sweat, and the rule card was crumpled in my grip. The hospital loomed in front of me, dark and silent, except for a faint flickering light in one of the upper windows. Room 6. I turned the key in the ignition, desperate to flee. The engine sputtered and died. Panic rose in my chest as I tried again. And again. Nothing. The suffocating silence outside pressed in, making my heartbeat thunder in my ears. I stepped out of the car, the frigid night air biting into my skin. A low hum filled the air, barely audible, like the distant sound of an oncoming train. I turned back toward the hospital. And then I saw them. Figures moved behind the windows. Slow, deliberate. Watching. One of them was me. I staggered back, my eyes widening in disbelief. It was like staring into a distorted mirror. The figure wore my uniform, its motions perfectly synchronized with mine, an eerie mockery of my movements. It lifted its hand, clutching a rule card identical to mine in its pallid fingers. I let go of my card as though it had scalded me, but when I glanced down, it had vanished. I looked back up, and the figure was gone, replaced by a sea of faces pressed against the window. Familiar faces, the patients, the doctor, the voices I had heard whispering through the halls. They were all there, staring at me, their mouths moving soundlessly. Then, suddenly, their words became clear.
You're one of us now.
My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. The humming swelled into an unbearable roar before everything faded into silence. When I came to, I was back inside the hospital. Room 6. The bed was neatly made, the air heavy and stale, and the rule card was once again clenched in my hand. But something had changed. The card was blank, except for a single, ominous message. Your shift never ends. I bolted for the door, but it refused to budge. The whispers began again, and the shadows stretched across the floor like grasping hands. I pounded against the door, screaming, but no one answered. No one ever would. To anyone reading this, if you're ever offered a night shift position at a small-town hospital and they give you a list of rules, destroy it. Burn it and get out while you can. Because once you're inside, there's no escape. They don't need your help. They need you. If you like the story, be sure to write your impressions in the comments. Which rule scared you the most? Why did it scare you? Be sure to subscribe, like and comment. See you in the next story.